Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll continue our exploration of the book The Idea of the World by Bernardo Kastrup. But before we start, let's quickly recap what we did last time. According to idealism, there is no fundamental separation between mind in here and the world out there. One of Kastrup's main points is that matter is the outer appearance of inner experience. In this context, we discussed the concept of the Markov blanket in the last video. It is vital to understand Kastrup's claims concerning dissociation. Going back to that discussion, there is a statement you should take note of. I showed you the image of interfering waves on water for you to use as a mental bridge to grasp this concept. Although the metaphor of water is flawed, it is helpful when trying to understand how, when our own energy field collides with the universal energy field that surrounds us, we make waves that, co-create the physical universe that we experience. We also talked about quantum physics briefly and how quantum field theory employs concepts like idealism, just using different terms. Quantum physics suggests that the properties of physical systems do not exist prior to being observed. The existence of a physical world independent of consciousness is merely a theoretical conclusion that we make based on our perceptions and their interpretation. This is hard for us to conceive because for centuries we've been culturally indoctrinated to see the world as something outside of ourselves and independent of mind. However, according to quantum field theory, all physical particles consist of particular patterns of self-excitation of the underlying quantum field, which is pretty much what Kastrup is saying, just in other words. We also touched upon the question why there seems to be an external world, independent of mind. A world that we can all share, hence differentiating idealism from solipsism. And finally, we touched on the question whether, according to idealism, AI can be conscious or not. In today's video, I will explore the topic of the unconscious, and we will look at evidence from neuroscience that supports the idealist stance. I will explore the concept of egoic control, and we will briefly revisit the topic of death. To tackle these topics, we need to first introduce some basic concepts from depth psychology. We just need to be clear on a couple of terms, so we'll be on the same page going forward. Depth psychology is a branch of psychology that explores the unconscious aspects of the human mind, basically investigating the influence of unconscious processes or thoughts, feelings, and behavior. According to depth psychology, the human psyche is divided into two subsegments, the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious part includes mental activities that a person can access through self-awareness. The ego is defined as the experiential center of the conscious segment of the human psyche. The ego arises when we metacognize about bodily sensations or thoughts that we might have at any given time. The ego has access to conscious content, and according to depth psychology, it is influenced by the unconscious. Even though the ego cannot directly access the unconscious, those contents can be triggered by sensory input or other thoughts and service to the conscious at any time. There are ways and means to uncover hidden content lingering in the unconscious. And one of them is analytical therapy, which often entails the recollection of dreams, another is synchronicities, and the third is creative activity. Those are all access points to the unconscious that can be leveraged. That is the state of knowledge with regards to depth psychology as far as I am aware. Kastrup addresses the unconscious because it is a potential threat to the analytic idealist stance. Analytic idealism claims that there is only phenomenal consciousness. That's it. That's the fundamental reality. It is the thing by which analytic idealists should be able to explain everything else. So someone could say, well, if there is something unconscious, then there is something that is not phenomenally conscious because it's unconscious. Therefore, analytic idealism cannot be right because, according to analytic idealism, there is only phenomenal consciousness. So this is why he brings it up. And he offers the view that what we call the unconscious is in fact phenomenally conscious. It is just not something that the ego is aware of and meta-conscious of. Meta-consciousness is the explicit awareness of phenomenally conscious states. Most of us at all times are meta-conscious of only a small subset of our experiences. Take, for instance, bodily functions. You're not constantly meta-conscious of the fact that you're breathing or that your digestion is going on. You're only meta-conscious of those functions when you put your attention to them. Still, you're at all times subliminally conscious of the fact that you're breathing and that your digestion is working. In other words, you were phenomenally conscious of them at all times, but you were not meta-conscious of them. You were not explicitly aware of them, but you were phenomenally conscious of them. Look to everything about that allows you to be phenomenally conscious of your breathing, for example. All of that was in place just moments ago as well, when we didn't talk about those things. Nothing changed since then. All your nerves were in place, only your attention was somewhere else. Now that we talk about your breathing and your digestion, you are meta-conscious of them. So when you're placing your focus of attention on an experience, you're explicitly aware of it and you're meta-conscious of it. Attention and reportability is the key to distinguish between unconscious and conscious thought. If you're aware of being conscious of something, you're also able to report on these things to somebody else. So Kastrup claims that what we call unconscious can be considered phenomenally conscious, and it becomes meta-conscious when we focus our attention on it. Another relevance in connection with analytic idealism is that while each experiential center of consciousness has their own private parallel stream of experience, the underlying total universal stream of consciousness is phenomenally conscious as well. We're not saying that the universe total is meta-conscious or self-conscious. We're saying it is phenomenally conscious. So in theory, we have mental access to the total universe. It is just that our ego is neither focusing awareness on universal consciousness contents, nor is our ego identifying with them, which essentially is the dissociated state that Kastrup refers to when he speaks of our individual minds. According to Kastrup, we are first and foremost consciousness itself. The rest of our self-image arises with time as thoughts and images are constructed in consciousness, and as we engage in a self-reflective loop of meta-consciousness with such thoughts and images. So essentially the self is a construct or a byproduct of the processing of sensory data. Interestingly, self-transcendence correlates with brain function impairment. Self-transcendence is defined as the abrupt broadening of one's sense of self through an abrupt enrichment of one's subjective inner life. For those of you who want to know more about Kastrup's take on the unconscious, I will link a video in the description box. It's a part of a course that Kastrup offers on YouTube. Empirical evidence from neuroscience directly suggests idealism to be a valid metaphysical framework. Instances of brain function impairment have been recorded scientifically to be accompanied by enrichment of conscious inner life and an expansion of the subject's sense of identity. Remember our discussion of the Markov blanket and how we concluded that the human brain represents the external materialized appearance of the dissociated consciousness inside the Markov blanket. Coming from that point of view, it makes sense to think that a reduction or impairment of normal brain function should trigger a respective reduction or impairment of the dissociation of the mind within the Markov blanket from the surrounding universal mind. So, less brain activity equals richer inner experience. While not all brain function impairments seem to have this effect on individuals, some do, and they have been measured. The type of impairments we are looking for affect the dissociative mechanisms whilst preserving cognitive function, so that subjects can still report on their expanded awareness after the fact. Now, there are certain types of brain function impairment that have been shown to be accompanied by enriched inner life. Such enriched states can also be described as self-transcending or mystical experiences. Near-death experiences are the prime examples of such self-transcending states that are associated with dramatically reduced brain function. Psychedelics have shown similar results in scientific experiments, and those experiments showed that psychedelics reduce brain activity levels. This is noteworthy because experiences in both NDEs and the use of psychedelics cannot be attributed to sensory inputs because they essentially are mental experiences. And this corroborates idealism, and it contradicts the prevailing materialist position, because materialism would need to prove the contrary. It would need to prove enhanced brain activities in NDEs and psychedelics, since they claim that consciousness arises from the brain. So, enhanced brain activity would be needed to explain enhanced inner experience, but the contrary is the case. Okay, let's recap real quick. Conscious mental states are those that a person both experiences and knows that he or she experiences. Unconscious mental states, on the other hand, are those that the person either does not experience or does not know that he or she experiences. When there is a reduction in neural activity in the brain, the ego gets suppressed and otherwise unconscious mental contents are being brought into awareness. So let's take this a step further. According to depth psychology, a neurosis is the expression of an inner conflict caused by the ego's refusal to acknowledge, confront, and ultimately integrate unwanted contents rising up from the unconscious. To keep such conflicts at bay, the ego uses a variety of defense mechanisms, among which are denial, distortion, dissociation, repression, and projection. So the ego has a need to avoid anxiety by exerting control. If you just look at history and if we examine the context of the rise of modern science with figures like Isaac Newton and the development of mechanistic explanations for natural phenomena, we find that as modern science gained prominence, it began to challenge traditional religious explanations, and this shift in understanding clashed with religious doctrines. So this is pretty scary stuff, when everything you believe in up to a certain point and found safety in just crumbles. And that is why it is understandable that the success of scientific inquiry bolstered confidence in people explaining the world in material terms. So by the late 19th century, the myths that had so far offered us meaning and comfort through the promise of immortality and a higher purpose became untenable. Kastrup says that ever since then the ego has sought to expand its power, seeking to control transcendence through technology. And it could be argued that the materialist paradigm is the ego's attempt to defend its own importance. It is a form of compensation, to use psychology speak. Because just think for a second about what the idealist philosophy ultimately means. It means that the ego is a byproduct of cognition. It is not anything in and of itself. So we are, as individuals, not so materially real as we would like to think. And that there also is no true division between us and people around us and the universe total. Ultimately, it's all one. And that can be a very scary thought. So it is much more comfortable to think that, I am solid, the world out there around me is solid, and we're clearly separated, everything is material, and any kind of mental phenomenon is just something that, happens on top of stuff. So the materialist's worldview protects and validates the ego, and it also is a way to uphold the meaning of the individual. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into modern pronouns. Let's keep it simple because it's complicated enough to deal with the pronouns I and you. In the context of analytical idealism, we can state that pronouns are used to refer to our alters. Remember, each person is an alter of universal consciousness. So they both point to something which is not different in kind, but just different in degree. I and you are not so separate after all. And ultimately, we are all one with the universe. So how can this inform us on death and what happens at death? Much of the literature regarding near-death experience seems to corroborate idealism. Death, as we discussed in an earlier episode, can be regarded as the end of dissociation. The end of dissociation can only mean a reintegration of memory, identity, and emotion that we lost at birth. This means that bodily death under idealism must correlate with an expansion of our felt sense of identity, with access to a broader set of memories, and with a general enrichment of our inner lives. So if you would ask, do I cease to exist when my physical body dies? Both yes and no would be a correct answer. It depends on what you mean by the pronoun I. If you refer to I as in you, the universal consciousness, then the answer is no. Universal consciousness never dies. If you refer to I as in your alter, then the answer is yes. According to Kastrup, in death, the dissociative boundary between your alter and the universe simply dissolves. So I really forced your hand today. That was a lot of information. And this episode actually concludes our covering Kastrup's book. And I would like to end this series on an inspiring note. At one point in the book, Kastrup says, I find this an intriguing thought, and there is something you can actually look at that might help you wrap your head around this concept. It is the Chladni sound wave experience, or the Chladni plate. I'm going to link a video in the description box below. Look at the video, it is really fascinating. Chladni was one of the pioneers of experimental acoustics, and the Chladni plate is a technique to visualize modes of vibration. And when I look at this, I'm thinking of how just, everything's energy, and how vibration is just miraculous in that it is able to produce different patterns, It's just become much easier to think that mind and matter are on a continuum. Anyway, I hope this has been of interest to you. If it has, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.